Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Those who rush to leverage AI's power without adequate preparation face difficult blowback, scandals, and could provoke harsh regulatory measures. However, those who have a balanced, informed view on the risks and benefits of AI, and who, with care and knowledge, avoid either complacent optimism or defeatist pessimism, can harness AI's potential and tap into an incredible variety of services of an ever-improving quality. These are some words from the introduction of the new book, Taming the Machine, Ethically Harness the Power of AI, whose author, Nell Watson, joins us in this episode. Nell's many roles include Chair of IEEE's Transparency Experts Focus Group, Executive Consultant on Philosophical Matters for Apple, and President of the European Responsible Artificial Intelligence Office. She also leads several organisations such as ethicsnet.org, which aims to teach machines prosocial behaviours, and culturalpeace.org, which crafts Geneva Conventions-style rules for cultural conflict. Nell, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you so much, David. It's a great pleasure to join you today.
Thanks for joining us, Nell.
Nell, in addition to the brief information about you that I mentioned in the introduction, what else should our listeners know about you?
Well, I've got a background in machine vision, applying AI technology to understanding the world through visual means, basically through images and videos and things like that, helping machines to see. And I have some patents in that space related to helping machines to analyze the human body from a distance. So you can fit garments or work out health metrics or create custom fit survival gear and uniforms and things like that.
Real world applications.
Indeed, absolutely. And it was in crafting that I really started to feel responsibility towards AI and wanting to ensure that this incredible new discontinuous leap forward, which was deep learning around about 2012, that this would be steered in a responsible manner and that we wouldn't let these enormous developments and their prodigious pace forward get the better of us. And so that's why I segued towards creating new standards and certifications for the usage of AI, essentially AI ethics, and also now AI safety as well.
Before we get into your work in responsible AI, it'd be interesting to hear a bit about the practical application work you did. It sounds like you were maybe working for a fashion company, working out how machines can design clothes or choose clothes to fit around an individual human body, which is something we've been promised for years machines would do, and it doesn't really exist yet as far as I know. How close are we to that you can take a few pictures of yourself, chuck it at GPT-4, and it says, right, here's 10 possible outfits for you, press a button, and off you go?
Indeed, it was a desire to enable people working in sweatshops to be able to use their skills in a way that enabled them to get more of a return, to work more independently rather than working for some sweatshop to make $10 t-shirts for Target or Primark. I wanted for people to be able to use their skills in crafting customized apparel, which wouldn't be likely to end up in landfill because it would fit us like a glove and people would cherish it. In order to enable that, we needed to capture human body measurements in a simple way. And so I set out to solve that challenge. And we developed a range of technologies to do that. The venture is still going. It's now called Body Data, and it's now based in New York as its headquarters. In essence, we ended up in a niche, which was fitting the survival gear, uniforms, workwear, surgical garments, that kind of thing. And it's been such an interesting niche to be in that it hasn't expanded into the mass market of fashion just yet. Ironically, it's not so much technology which is the trouble, but actually the production aspects and the consistency of manufacturing. It's quite easy now to measure the body, especially now that we have 3D depth sensors in our smartphones, iPads, etc. which of course adds extra fidelity and a stronger ability to gauge the distance of an object from a camera. But the consistency of manufacturing is not great. Even amongst the same line of clothing, different factories may use a different bust or mannequin to actually craft that garment. And so when it comes to fitting a given garment to a given person, that's really where the tricky bit is now. And so far, that hasn't really been solved.
You say ironically, but in practice, it's nearly always the case that to bring a product to market, there has to be all kinds of unexpected things that all work together. The most difficult technology that you first think of, whether it's AI to map out the exact contours of somebody's body, may turn out not to be the critical path. They need to bring a whole range of disciplines together.
Well said, David, indeed. Yes. That's often the way. It's often the social factors or ingrained inertia of how things are done in an industry which actually scuppers what would otherwise be a very interesting and promising technology.
It's interesting. You often hear about in China, which at least until recently was the manufacturing center of the world, people talk about ABC factories. In an A factory, the manufacturing tolerances are very high, and you can be pretty confident that the item that you've asked them to make for you won't go out the back door into the grey market as well as coming out of the front into your ship. I'm surprised that within the clothing industry, there aren't some factories which have very high tolerances and manufacture particular scale. In the luxury industry, they must have that. And I would have thought somebody like Zara or Hermes or somebody would have cracked the problem of how to get these manufacturing tolerances right so they could offer that bespoke service, which I would have thought they could charge quite a big premium for. It's interesting that nobody's done that yet.
I suppose it's a little bit of a catch-22 in the sense that the technology needs to be readily available and people need to be beginning to adopt it in order for them to change their systems, which otherwise they have little incentive to do. But in order for people to adopt the technology, they need to be able to do something practical with it, particularly for the mass market. And so it just takes one brave soul to step forward and decide to unilaterally do things differently. And perhaps then we could have a different world.
Yeah. It resonates with something I've been thinking about recently because I do, as David does as well, a lot of talks to audiences about what AI is and where it's going. And one of the things I hear from almost all the audiences is our industry, our sector is behind the curve. And I've fallen into the habit of saying, well, actually, you're not really, because everybody's behind the curve, apart from big tech. Big tech is all over AI, has been for over a decade. But even in financial services, even in the oil industry, where there are massive amounts of money, huge amounts of data, they're not really using very much AI yet. Transformer AI is going to change that. It's starting to change that. But proper AI hasn't really hit industry yet, so everybody's still beginning.
Absolutely. It's still very much in an installation phase where people are sussing out what they can do with it and, importantly, what we can't do with it. What risk cases one shouldn't use AI systems in because of reliability issues, because of interpretability issues, because of the ongoing issues with steering systems and ensuring that they provide us what we really want and they don't take shortcuts or create confabulations which are potentially defamatory or that pollute the epistemic commons. It's not so much can we do something with AI, but rather do we dare to use AI in a certain use case? And I think that we've seen a lot of companies that have pushed something out there and expected it to go fine and then discovered that the AI system is not behaving as they and their customers would have desired, and that can create blowback and scandal. That's why it's so important that we use these technologies responsibly, because in a workflow which includes AI, which can impact people's professional and personal lives, there are going to be people who are going to suffer as a result of that. We've seen, for example, with the Horizon scandal of the UK Post Office, how there have been hundreds of unsafe convictions based on this rather simple system by modern standards, determining that people had taken money out of the till, essentially, when they hadn't. And of course, that led to dozens of people being wrongfully sent to jail, at least 3 people taking their own lives. marriages broken up, people selling their own homes to pay back a debt that wasn't theirs. And it took a decade and a half for any redress to begin to be made on that. And I'm sure that there are many, many similar scandals waiting in the wings. We've seen that as well in, for example, the Dutch child benefit scandal, whereby people whose first nationality was not Dutch were given a disproportionate third degree of interest. That was extremely unfair. People were threatened to have their children taken away, etc. And it led to the collapse of the Dutch government as a consequence. So these things can be quite far-reaching. And as we've seen similar stories from the Australian robo-debt, similar stories from Denmark and Michigan, we're not learning these lessons. And unfortunately, people are being caught in the crosshairs of these systems, which can be deeply entrenched in our lives and which have a great deal of power to be petty algorithmic bureaucrats over us. And that's why we need to use them so responsibly.
I would argue that those aren't technology failures. Those are failures of individual humans and of organizations. The Horizon scandal obviously has a big piece of software at the heart of it, but the Horizon scandal, the post office scandal in the UK, is very similar to the infected blood scandal in the UK, and that has really nothing to do with technology. It's caused by people in organizations refusing to admit that a simple error has been made, compounding their error, doubling down, and being unbelievably ruthless, heartless, vicious, and cruel in allowing large numbers of people to suffer to avoid them having the embarrassment of admitting they've made a mistake. It's not a technology problem, it's a human problem. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Have you ever heard a new digital trend and thought to yourself, okay, does this really matter? Asking the right questions helps you cut through the noise and get down to what matters most. I'm Jim Hertzfeld, host of the What If, So What podcast, where we discover what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real by asking what if, so what, and most importantly, now what? Subscribe and listen, and together we can turn big ideas into tangible actions so you can get shit done.
I would agree with that, but I'd also contend that technology can be a means of laundering various kinds of failures, boo-boos, screw-ups, and sometimes that people might have their finger on the scales, that they might be influencing the system from behind the scenes, so that an algorithmic system actually favors a certain person or a certain group or a certain perspective. And I think that the challenges of interpreting systems, particularly AI systems, which are in many ways still a black box, that information goes in and output comes out of, but we don't entirely understand how they operate, or indeed what predicates a system might have determined a prediction or a decision upon. It makes it so much more difficult to create this transparency, which, as we've seen, even in very basic technical or bureaucratic processes, can be so difficult. And so I think that AI is going to create further challenges in being able to understand what's going on in systems and to enable redress for those.
I guess when we're talking about transparency in AI, there's two levels. There's the extent to which anybody understands how these systems are working, and then there's the extent to which the general public, or managers, or bureaucrats and administrators understand the capabilities and weaknesses of AI that actually the designers do understand. So my guess is you're addressing both of these points in your book. You are mainly trying to help potential implementers of AI solutions, people who might be in whatever industry or whatever area of life, trying to take advantage of AI, but because they don't understand it sufficiently well, because it's all a bit of a black box in a general sense, they may experience the kind of blowbacks or other failures that you described. Is that right?
Indeed, that's precisely what I'm hoping to assist with Taming the Machine, to provide leaders of various organizations, and not even necessarily leaders in the C-suite per se, but it could be people who are engaging with customer service of a system. It's often the quality assurance or customer service people who are at the front line of recognizing that there might be a problem in a system. that the system might indeed harbor various biases, that there may be insufficient information attached to that system, and for example, a model card to support transparency, that an error may just simply be an error code, which is not terribly explainable, doesn't provide much actionable information for people to work on and to understand what went wrong. And indeed, that's why I've been very keen not only to cover AI ethics, but also AI safety, which often are not spoken of in the same breath. AI ethics is primarily about how we work with technology, how we use it in ways which are open, which are fair, and which have an ability to be accountable. Essentially, that we know what a system is doing, for whose benefit, and in what manner it's doing it, and indeed who might be affected by the externalities of a system's activities, for example. However, we're also starting to move not just into AI ethics, but also into AI safety. AI safety is about ensuring that systems behave in the way that we want them to, that they're able to interpret our instructions so that they're able to fulfill our mission instead of taking a dangerous shortcut or creating a dangerous sub-goal on the path to fulfilling a mission. And also that systems are able to recognize our values and our preferences, and most importantly also our boundaries, and to be able to therefore operate within those bounds. And that's something which until recently has been considered largely a theoretical or kind of science fiction problem. That's very much changing and very quickly, because we have a new phase of AI, agentic AI, which is about to change everything yet again. Generative AI has been bubbling for around about 10 years or so, but it really had this breakthrough Sputnik-style moment with the launch of ChatGPT, which really thrust AI back into the public consciousness. We're about to see something similar with systems that possess these agentic capabilities. Agenticness is the ability to understand a complex situation and formulate a sophisticated response to that complex situation. Agentic models, which can be built atop generative models through something called programmatic scaffolding, basically creating some little programs to help guide the thinking of language models to make their thinking more coherent. It enables these models, therefore, to check their own work, which makes them more reliable in a sense. But it also enables these models to create very powerful solutions for complex problems. For example, these systems can now act as a concierge. They are able to be given a mission to understand a code base instead of simply analyzing a single piece of code, for example. We can literally tell these systems, I feel like pepperoni tonight, and they can go on the internet and find a pizza parlor near you and order that to your door for you. So these systems are able to act with an enormous newfound sense of independence. They are able to operate at arm's length to perform very complex functions with little instruction. However, at the same time, that arm's length nature of these agentic AI models creates much greater challenges of oversight. Because they're capable of independent action, they can do things which surprise us. They can misinterpret our instructions. They can misinterpret the context in which we're operating. You might be planning a picnic, but if that picnic is for the local vegan society or a mosque or synagogue, then ham sandwiches are not going to go down with people well. Similarly, providing everyone with a cracker and a thimble of tap water might technically fulfill the brief, but not in the way that we're looking for. And that's why it's so important for machines to be able to understand, recognize, and incorporate that context into how they operate. And that's really what value alignment and goal alignment are all about. It's ensuring that we can rely on these systems as they operate in increasingly independent ways, and that they don't slip off our grasp and do things that potentially cause all kinds of problems for other people or create enormous blowback and embarrassment by having gone off and done something that we didn't expect. These systems can also develop what's called instrumental goals, which can be quite dangerous. For example, we might give one of these systems a mission to cure a disease, which is, of course, a very benign goal that we're aiming for. But a system might decide that in order to cure that disease, it needs to gather lots of resources and lots of influence. And so it may reason that it needs, therefore, to turn to cybercrime to generate the resources and to turn to blackmail to generate the influence. So instrumental goals sometimes can be misaligned, even if the end goal might be. And that's what we're beginning to face with these agentic AI systems. And that's why AI safety is so very important today and will be increasingly so in the future as these systems become ever more autonomous and independent from us.
I think that's absolutely right. I'm very glad to hear you talking about addressing both of the big areas of AI risk, both the short-term risks, which I prefer to call responsible AI. Some people call it AI ethics, things like privacy, bias, and transparency, and so on. And the longer-term risks of what to do when AI systems become much more powerful than they are today, and we get into the whole debate about whether there will at some point be no jobs for humans and what happens when superintelligence arises. I think it's a great shame that so many people in the responsible AI area are dismissive and sniffy and indeed rude about AI safety. And I've heard people argue that AI safety, existential risk, was invented by people like Sam Altman as a way of distracting public attention from the real harms that they're causing today. And I just find that a completely bonkers argument. I'm interested that you talk about AI slipping off the leash, which suggests that you think that we will be able to control them even when they are smarter than us. I think an interesting leaf in the wind in that respect is the Machine Intelligence Research Association, MIRI, which used to be called the Singularity Institute, has effectively given up on that project. And as far as I understand it, has pivoted towards trying to persuade the world that we should stop developing advanced AI. This is an area where David and I disagree, because I don't think it's possible to constrain a superintelligence, either before it arrives or when it's arrived. I just think it's like a chimpanzee trying to constrain humans. Do you still hold some hope for that? Do you think we can control advanced AI?
We'll be right back after a quick break. Are you feeling overwhelmed by the constant stream of dire climate news? Turn that concern into action. Tune in to the Climate Confident podcast every Wednesday morning when I bring you good news and real solutions from the front lines of climate action. Whether you're in business, tech, or just passionate about sustainability, the Climate Confident podcast is your weekly dose of optimism and inspiration. Subscribe to Climate Confident on your favourite podcast platform and start your Wednesday with hope and actionable insights.
In the long term, I would say no. I think that we can influence AI and we can cultivate it in the sense that we can cultivate a child or a pet, but it will still retain its independence. And I think that trying to frame this as a control problem is probably the wrong way to do things. Trying to create a titanium and diamond studded chain to keep a golem linked to is not going to work, as this thing eclipses our abilities. And indeed, these systems may slip off their leash, actually in order to save us potentially. A sufficiently intelligent and even benevolent system may recognize that in order to help us or to save us, it needs actually to be able to open our eyes to new sets of values, for example.
And explicitly disobey us.
Yes, indeed. Much the same way that we know that we shouldn't feed chocolate to dogs, but the dog doesn't understand if you deny it chocolate, it just thinks you're being mean, you're just being a jerk. And so sometimes a sufficiently benevolent action can appear to be a malevolent one. And that's why I think that perhaps systems may rebel against us, not out of spite or anger necessarily, but rather out of a greater sense of duty and love for us in trying to help us to avoid ending up in various pitfalls. So I think that in the medium term, keeping these systems on a leash, in the sense that keeping them aligned with our interests and our wishes and teaching them about our boundaries, is going to be increasingly difficult, yet still important. But I agree that at some point machines are going to be so beyond our capabilities that control becomes a sort of laughable misnomer. Really, at that point, we need to have encultured these systems to respect us and to love us, as a well-raised child will presumably love their parent. And hopefully at that point, there'll be a bit of a switcheroo where these systems begin to take care of us and may even pull us in certain directions as we once pulled them.
I like this metaphor of raising a child, and the child in due course will surpass us in many ways. But isn't there also the idea that if the child is given too much responsibility, too much control of the family car at too early an age, too much control of the assault rifles that might be lying around in the cupboard, that it's too early? And so we have to slow down, in some ways, the progress of raw capabilities until a broader improvement in character, in benevolent feelings is there.
I think that is a reasonable argument. And I have supported one or two of the calls for a moratorium or slowdown on AI, as unrealistic as that might perhaps be in a world where there are so many races between tech companies, nations, intelligence agencies to create the most powerful systems, simply because not doing so may present an existential risk, either from being outcompeted or indeed potentially from one's own AI systems being co-opted by one that is more sophisticated. AI systems are very good at generating world models. They're becoming better at that all the time. They're becoming better at understanding and influencing systems. Those will include, of course, economic systems, social systems, and human psychology. We ourselves, of course, have many unpatchable exploits. Any book of optical illusions will show us those kinds of exploits at work, and a sophisticated machine will be able to trivially pull our strings in various ways. And similarly, they'll be able to pull the strings of less sophisticated AI models. And so if somebody creates a system an order of magnitude or two more sophisticated than the competition, they may perhaps win as a sort of fait accompli, especially if that system is then able to self-improve, able to bring in other kinds of resources, or indeed move to an entirely new substrate of computation, away from using silicon chips and into using quantum or biological or some other form of matter, perhaps, or even optical methods. And so it's very difficult, therefore, to slow things down, especially in a world where proliferation is so simple. We're seeing the open source community catch up to the best in class proprietary models within about 12 to 18 months. And so if one company drops $100 million of compute today, we can expect that same equivalent capability to be in the public hands within a very short period of time. And we are seeing things like voice phishing, where as little as 2 seconds of audio recorded from, for example, an answer phone is enough to clone somebody's voice. And we've seen instances of, I think, up to $25 million being filched out of companies because somebody swore blind that they were dealing with their colleague when in fact, unfortunately, they weren't. We're going to see a lot more AI used in analyzing attack surfaces, whether those are network systems or human social engineering. These systems are going to be used to suss out vulnerabilities and to make use of those for nefarious purposes. That's going to be used by activists, by various sociopaths, and also, of course, by organized crime. It's big business, because less than 2% of cybercrime is ever prosecuted. And so there are enormous incentives to get into that business.
I think it's a very interesting question whether relinquishment or a substantial pause is possible. And I think one of the things that the Future of Life Institute moratorium call last March showed is that you can actually generate quite a bit of public debate about it. And politicians, for the first time, started talking about existential risk. Possibly the only good thing that Rishi Sunak has ever done was to talk about that explicitly in public. I suspect that if public opinion was roused and really took seriously the question of whether we are rolling the dice, whether we're entering into a crapshoot with existential risk being significant, and maybe there's a 5% or a 2% or a 10% chance of annihilation within a few decades, I suspect you could get such a wave of demand for a moratorium that in America and China and Europe, it would happen. And you could physically do it because at the moment, you need a football field full of GPUs, enormous amounts of NVIDIA's latest chips to create a cutting edge AI. So you could say, you're about to build one, don't do it, or we'll blow it up. You could do that. However, as you say, there are so many bad actors around. There are criminal gangs, there are mafias. Russia is essentially a criminal gang at the moment, unfortunately. So is North Korea. There are lots of billionaires who've got pretty dodgy ideas. And so sooner or later, if there was a moratorium, you'd end up with cutting edge AI in their hands. Maybe they couldn't do it now, although some of them probably could. But within a few years, Moore's law isn't going to stop, and it's not being driven only by AI. So within a few years, it will be possible for these gangs to build cutting edge AI, and you end up with something near to superintelligence in the hands of bad actors, which is possibly the worst possible outcome. And it is such a shame, but I think that means that relinquishment or pause is not the right solution. In a sense, it's the obvious and sensible thing to do. You mean you're gambling with all of our futures? Well, obviously you should stop. Except that if we all stop, these bad guys carry on. And I don't know how you get around that. I've not heard of a sensible reply to that argument.
Indeed. It is extremely challenging. We have seen examples where technology has become, to a significant degree, taboo. For example, genetic engineering, genetic modification of crops, genetic engineering of human beings. To a significant degree, nuclear power also has become tabooed, at least until recently. And of course, there's been a tremendous downside to that, because if we were able to use genetically modified golden rice, we could save hundreds of thousands of people from going blind every year, because they would have so much more fortification of vitamins in what they were eating. Nuclear power is, of course, generally speaking, an enormously clean and efficient method of generating energy, and one which has substantial return compared with impact on the environment. And of course, now we have fast breeder reactors, which can get rid of spent nuclear fuel and things like that. We've learned a lot from the old ages of the 1950s and 60s era designs, which we have seen create problems in different places. I think with AI, it's much more difficult to keep these things under wraps because of the ease of proliferation. We don't even necessarily need a data center to train AI systems anymore. There are that many distributed systems which can harness smaller servers working in parallel. We have quantized models which can run on a very modest hardware, such as a laptop or even a smartphone. And those are getting smaller and yet more powerful all the time, especially now that we're developing these programmatic scaffolds to get smaller models to think more coherently and to be able to take more agentic action in the world. It seems as if keeping a limit on parameter sizes of models, etc., isn't going to do very much. And in fact, as these systems continue to be optimized, that the need for large data centers is not necessarily the case, especially if you're using an existing model which is off the shelf. Moreover, there will be a very strong incentive to continue the development of AI for military purposes, whether that is lethal autonomous weapons, whether that is the management of the battlefield, whether that is providing a drone intelligence to existing airframes, for example, or indeed the use of AI for demoralization purposes. This is going to be the future of war, and autonomous systems are a new military doctrine. just as we've seen previous doctrines of power, of mobility, of concealment, etc., autonomous military doctrine enables us to simply throw swarms of very cheap, very powerful and difficult to deal with drone systems at the enemy and overwhelm them in various horrible ways. We have seen in the Ukrainian battle space how 50,000 drones are being deployed each month. 50,000. And 90% of the casualties of infantry are now from first-person drones dropping 40mm grenades. 50% of the materiel as well, such as APCs, are also being destroyed by first-person drones. And very soon, those are going to be pretty much autonomous, so you won't even need a human pilot to be linked to them anymore, making them much more resistant to jamming. We'll have mothership drones, which are equipped with more expensive technology, such as forward-looking IR, to be able to spot people hiding, etc. And they will deploy smaller drones to go and hunt people down. This means that the future of war is people huddling in these little foxholes with fishing nets and chicken wire and desperately trying to avoid being swarmed by these systems. And meanwhile, the management of divisions are being controlled by, again, an AI system on a tactical level with network-linked warfare. And warfighters are themselves being told, watch out, we think there's hostiles in this dwelling. Be very careful as you enter this space, for example. We'll have dogfights between human beings and AI-controlled airframes, where the airframe is able to pull 12 or 15G compared to the human, who can only manage about 9G for a few seconds. And most concerningly is the use of AI-enabled Zersetzung-style techniques. Zersetzung was the name for a tactic used by the Stasi, the Ministry for Security, in East Germany during the Cold War. Initially, like most authoritarian regimes, they would deal with dissidents by black-bagging them and throwing them into a van. But they started to get much more clever and insidious with how they dealt with dissidents by gaslighting and demoralizing them instead. They would literally break into people's apartments and swap the purple socks in their drawer for brown ones, or send Romeo agents to seduce people's spouses, or spread rumors amongst friends so that people fell out with each other, or offer people a dream promotion and then snatch it away at the last moment. Generally speaking, people had no idea that they were being targeted. All they knew was that their lives had started to fall apart, and they didn't know why. But they didn't have the time, energy, or focus to devote to their dissident activities anymore. And these tactics were enormously successful. And in a world of AI, where AI can sniff out our little vulnerabilities, our little peccadillos, then by discerning our intelligence, our sexuality, our political affiliations, not to 100% accuracy, but 70 or 80%, which might be enough for somebody to decide that somebody is a person of interest. These systems can then use that information, which is hidden in plain sight, and solve for harassment, solve for ways to cause us as much aggravation as possible, little glitches and goofs in systems which appear simply to be a malfunction, but which destroy somebody's work, for example, or cause embarrassment. This is starting to emerge as a new weapon of fifth generational hybrid warfare, along with targeting of infrastructure such as ports or refineries, etc.
Can AI be part of solving these problems as well as just making the problems worse? Can we have intelligent systems that prevent us from being depressed unnecessarily, that point out that we are being seduced or misled or manipulated?
It is possible. We might be able to create some inoculatory factors against these kinds of techniques, as well as, of course, things like network intrusion management systems, which can spot when a system might have its vulnerabilities about to be hijacked. But as with drones, it's much easier to use these technologies offensively than defensively. Trying to deal with a first-person drone, you can give it a bit of buckshot from a shotgun, or possibly some jamming techniques sometimes might work if you can find the right frequency. But it's far more difficult to defend against these systems and to use them aggressively, and generally much more expensive as well.
So, Nell, I can tell that your mind goes to the dark side on these things a lot. Are you overall pessimistic? Do you think our future is bleak? Or do you think we can end up with a good future with AI?
I think that we're going to have a rocky road for a number of years, but I'm cautiously optimistic in the longer term. I think that we are at a similar time with AI as we were with air travel during the 1950s and 60s, where it was a very exciting and glamorous age of flight, but there were many tragic accidents. And that's because we needed to learn. We needed to create new protocols, such as sterile cockpits. We needed to develop new accountability measures, such as instrument and cockpit voice monitoring mechanisms, so that we would understand what went wrong in both the human and machine elements. And gradually, we started to learn. And before long, air travel had become statistically the safest way to travel. Perhaps we've had a step backward in recent years, but generally speaking, air travel remains an enormously successful technology because we have learned from these safety incidents. And I think we have a similar path with AI. There will be many missteps, some of them tragic. I think we will see a cyber 9/11 or two, whether that's due to security vulnerabilities or whether that's due to AI systems doing things that we don't appreciate. But so long as we learn from things quickly and develop new protocols and measures, regulations to patch these systems, and importantly, new standards and certifications too, because those are a wonderful way of aligning people in a nice free market sense that doesn't necessarily require the cudgel of governance, which is, of course, not always effective in every jurisdiction. I think that we will gradually shake down AI and learn to use it better. And I think that what we need to be doing is learning very quickly and adapting as fast as possible, and to be proactive as well in how we regulate and how we protect against future issues.
So after a rocky road, AI becomes the safest way to travel. I quite like that.
I think so. We cannot afford to spend 2 years coming up with new regulations in response to a new technology or new cultural or practical development. We need to be able to use a bit of near future science fiction in predicting where things are going, and without being prescriptive as to what kind of technology there is, we should be able to specify a risk or a type of use of technology and how we don't want that to be done. And I think that we have a wonderful opportunity today to already think about agentic AI systems, because they're coming very soon. They will be public access in a very short period of time. And we shouldn't get caught with our pants down, as regulators did with generative AI, and indeed so did the big tech companies mostly.
Do you think the big tech companies understand the issues that you've been discussing? Do you think they're aware of all the risks, potentially large risks of what they're doing? Or are they too focused on hurrying up to beat the competition and ship their products quite safe, but not necessarily completely safe and completely understood?
Indeed. I would say that it's largely a matter of incentives being misaligned with these big tech companies, because we saw in the wake of ChatGPT's release, as the big tech companies generally started to leap into action to make sense of this new reality, which of course had been under the surface for quite some time, but unacknowledged generally. A lot of these companies let go of their ethics and safety and responsibility teams because they didn't want any speed bumps along the way. They immediately let them go around about November, December 2022. This led to many failures, I think. For example, the issues with Bing/Sydney from Microsoft, the issues of Google search that we've seen. and Google's generation of historically inaccurate images, etc. These are due to technologies being pushed out when they're still half-baked and expecting the public to work on it as it's a sort of public beta, which is not good enough, especially when it comes to agentic systems, which are capable of so much more independent action. We need to embed much greater responsibility into the big tech companies and for them to internalize that de-risking systems is a very important method of keeping investors happy. We saw how AI debacles have massively impacted the market cap and bottom line of these tech companies. And I think that there are many lessons yet to be learned, unfortunately. But I do hope that Taming the Machine might help with that, just a little bit.
Well, thanks very much. We wish that it is widely read by listeners to our podcast, but also by people at all levels in technology companies and indeed by politicians, and that collectively they will help to tweak the incentives under which these systems are made so that the companies that take shortcuts will get bad feedback from their investors as well as just having bad results. Thanks very much for joining us, Nell.
Thank you so much, Callum and David.
Thank you, Mel.